For all of you wondering where your various breakout sessions are taking place, I will announce that in a minute. I hope you guys all enjoyed lunch, and thank you for coming back to join us for the rest of the day. We will now split up into different working rooms in different locations. As I stated before, because of security concerns, please keep your tags on. You will be escorted to the different rooms based on the sessions you have chosen. The first session, the role of radical Islam in spreading anti-Semitism, will take place here in this room. So for those of you who are in that session, please stay here. The next session, a vaccine against anti-Semitism, will be taking place in the round room, which you will be escorted to. And the final session on legislation is not enough, will take place in the Avriel room. You will be escorted to that room as well. We will see all of you back here at 2:30 for a coffee break, where we will then share a number, 3:30, thank you. We will then meet back here at 3:30 for another coffee break, where we will share more updates with you. I hope you guys have a productive afternoon, and we will see you shortly.
Those of you who are going to the session on legislation, please follow me.
Legislation, please follow Ruti.
And those going to the education working group, come with me, please.
Anyone going to the education working group, please follow Tanya. Those of you who are interested in radical Islam, you will be staying in this room. Thank you very much. So Tanya just told them that she's taking them, but you can follow Tanya. Sajal?
Hello, good afternoon. Okay, good afternoon. It's nice to see a few old friends who we haven't seen in about a year and a half, so it's nice to see people. I'm Charles Small. I'm going to moderate this panel discussion. We have Shimon Samuels from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Paris who will be speaking. Haris Rafiq has kindly offered to speak to replace one of our colleagues, Dina. And Lorenzo Vedino, I hope, will be online with us. I don't know where he is. He's in Washington and will be joining us momentarily. So the topic of today's conversation, ladies and gentlemen in the back. Okay. Okay, so the topic of today's conversation is the role of radical Islam in spreading anti-Semitism. And the question is this a new type of terror? So I'm going to have the prerogative of the moderator of the chair. I'm going to speak to the subject for a few minutes, and then introduce my colleagues to speak. Each of them will speak for 10 minutes, and I hope we'll have a good amount of time for a conversation, to take some questions and comments, and to try and go deeper into the subject matter. So first, I would like to start with, I guess, hopefully constructive criticism. I know my colleagues and I have found so far the discourse to be quite descriptive in the morning sessions so far of anti-Semitism. We know anti-Semitism is exploding. It's exploding from the radical right, from the radical left, and from radical Islam or political Islam. And each of these reactionary social movements, these three movements, are using the ideologies of anti-Semitism as an element of these social movements. So my first question as a scholar, and I'm the director of a research center called ISGAP, that is a research center, an academic scholarly research center dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism from an interdisciplinary perspective. The first question that I would like to ask you is, why do you think anti-Semitism is exploding? So it's one thing to do descriptive analysis, and descriptive analysis of anti-Semitism is very important, and I don't want to underestimate it. But why in 2021 is new forms of contemporary anti-Semitism exploding? What are the economic, political causes of this new phenomenon, or this return of the anti-Semitisms that we've experienced historically? Why is this happening? And I think as students of the subject of anti-Semitism, as scholars, as diplomats, as community leaders, we need to ask the question, why? And to begin to understand why these processes are with us and why are they accelerating? Why is anti-Semitism accelerating? What are the conditions that are enabling this phenomenon to expand? So we have to move away just from our descriptive analysis to understand the causes. And I would like to speak to some of the causes. And I think from my perspective, I've done a lot of work, and my colleagues have done a lot of work on issues of globalization and neoliberalism. There's been a profound shift in economic, social, and cultural policy and processes in the last 40 years with neoliberal globalization. There's been a movement of leading countries, of the G7 or the G8, major international organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and other organizations that play a prominent role in governance nationally and internationally, that came up with this model of neoliberalism. There was a belief that the state was hampering the development of economic development, and with the hampering of economic development, there was the hampering of democratic practices and freedoms. There was a belief that if the state could be limited, that free markets would expand. And with the expansion of free markets, there would be an expansion of economic growth and an expansion of democratic practice. This was the ideology of this model. This model has been imposed on many societies, many states, for the last 40 years. So from a neoliberal perspective, the state was weakened to bring about economic development and more freedom. From the Islamist perspective, the state was perceived as the vestiges of Western imperialism and colonialism, and the state was to be obliterated and replaced with a caliphate. So here you have two powerful forces, neoliberalism and political Islam, who wanted to either destroy or weaken the state. Now the state in many societies, from Egypt to Canada, at different levels and different levels of efficiency and of prominence, the state was a unifying factor. The state provided social services and benefits, housing, healthcare, education. So in Egypt, the state would subsidize basic levels of nutrition, basic levels of education to about a grade 6 level of education. And in places like Western Europe and Canada, the states would provide excellent healthcare, top-rate university education that was basically provided by the society. This created this sense of modernization, a hope for the future. It created strong notions of citizenship. People had, even though there were differences in society, People were of different cultures, different races, different ethnicities. It was a unifying force, a strong sense of citizenship. As the state weakened and this unified identity in Canada or in Egypt or in Belgium, as this began to weaken and societies became more fragmented, as the state weakens, we see the fragmentation of society and the marginalization of vast swaths of population. In Europe, even in North America, I think some of the unrest in the last couple of years in the United States points to profound levels of marginalization of immigrant communities, of racialized communities, and the like. We have the disenfranchisement of large sectors of the population, even in industrialized, wealthy countries, and most certainly in countries in the Middle East, in parts of Africa and Asia, where societies or states are actually at the point where they're failing. And we can look at Syria, Iraq. My colleagues and I consider what happened in Syria a form of genocide. You have the complete breakdown of society where these reactionary social movements using anti-Semitism, using reactionary notions of identity, have come and filled vacuums that existed where the state was, have come to fill the vacuum of education, healthcare, and the like. So these shifts, these paradigm shifts in governance, in economic and social and cultural processes have left vacuums for political Islam, for radical forms of reactionary politics in places like Hungary, Poland, Austria, right-wing populism. I think it happened in the United States under Trump. It evoked right-wing nationalism and racism and xenophobia. So you see the rise of right-wing nationalism. And of course, in spaces like in the media of record, in universities, in some of the left-leaning political parties, you see the radicalization on the left. So the center, as the state was weakened and the center of societies weakened through neoliberalism, you see the movement of reactionary social forces filling vacuums that were once the space of inclusion, of citizenship, and of development. So I think these structural changes in our economies, in our political systems, point to the marginalization of vast amounts of people, the insecurity, economic insecurities, cultural insecurities of vast swaths of the population, which is the prime environment where reactionary social movements grow. After the Second World War and after the Shoah, the world got together and said, never again. Never again will we allow the economic and political realities of such levels of marginalization which create the atmosphere where the Nazis and fascism and reactionary social movements would grow, that we would never allow that to happen. There'd be a level of employment, minimum wages, minimum levels of housing, minimum levels of education, minimum levels of inclusion into economic, social, and cultural processes, which in this global order, we have clearly forgotten those lessons. Vast amounts of migration, vast amounts of immigration, refugees, states failing, systems failing, and this is the situation that is ripe for these reactionary social movements. So I think, with respect, we have to begin to understand these political, economic, and social processes which we are in, which are, in my view, causing this rise of reactionary forces, which many of these forces are using anti-Semitism. So today we're going to speak about one of these three challenges, is political Islam. And I would also like to point out, we were speaking about the women's marches in the United States, how they've marginalized Jewish women. We spoke about the Israeli truck in the Philadelphia Food Festival that was banned. Important. In the work at ISGAP, we did an 8-year research project where we were following the money. We found $3 billion in undocumented funds going to American universities from the Muslim Brotherhood, from Qatar and other actors. What is the impact of this in this free market of education or higher education? And if ISGAP found $3 billion, I assure you the number is infinitely higher. This research that we've done has led to a federal investigation in the United States into illegal and undocumented funding going to American universities. The last interim report found $6.5 billion now that the government is looking. And it's my understanding the next interim report will show that there are $18 billion in undocumented funding going to American universities from foreign sources. Yale University, my old alma mater, forgot for 6 years to file income tax reports on their funding to the Department of Education and the IRS. They said it was a clerical error. Harvard University gives one total of all their foreign funding. They don't say who gave it, which countries it came from. They give one total. And they refuse to work with the government in fulfilling their obligations under the law. So these are some of the structural challenges that we're facing. So to unpack these very important issues, we're honored to have three wonderful guests. The first speaker will be Shimon Samuels. Shimon is originally from the UK. He has degrees from the Hebrew University and the London School of Economics, as well as Keio University in Tokyo and the University of Pennsylvania. He is the Director for International Relations of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and he's based in Paris, and he's been working exhaustively for many decades on all of these issues, and it's an honor that he's with us here on the panel. Joining us, hopefully online, is Dr. Lorenzo Vadino. Lorenzo is the director for the program on extremism at George Washington University. He's an expert on political Islam in Europe and North America. His research for more than 20 years has examined the mobilization and the dynamics of jihadist networks in the West, government counter-radicalization policies, and activities of the Muslim Brotherhood inspired organizations in Europe and North America. And he's well published and has worked on many issues. Also, a last-minute addition to our panel is Haris Rafiq. Haris has also been working for many years on these issues. He was the founder of the Quilliam Foundation, which was a recently closed organization, unfortunately, of Muslim intellectuals fighting political Islam and anti-Semitism from a Muslim perspective. And I'm also very honored by the fact that Haris Rafiq, a longtime friend who I met at a global forum here 12 years ago in Jerusalem, is working with us at ISGAP on several projects. So he will be speaking on radicalization and de-radicalization programs in Europe and beyond. So the first speaker for 10 minutes will be Dr. Shimon Samuels.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I opened our Paris office in 1980 on the eve of Sukkot, and I was visiting a very prominent Israeli journalist, Tamar Golan. Some may remember her. She had a house guest, and she lived on the corner, for those who know Paris, of Rue Copernic. Her house guest, Aliza, was the wife of the well-known filmmaker, Micha. And she just arrived from Israel. Tamar asked, "Is there anything that you need for dinner?" I was asked. And she said, "Yeah, a few dates. Go down with Shimon. He'll show you the fruit shop near the synagogue." At the corner, I continued walking straight. Aliza entered Rue Copernic, where minutes later she met her death. Next morning, Prime Minister Raymond Barre announced a bomb set for Jews killed 4 innocent Frenchmen. The death toll was 1 Portuguese delivery man, a late worshipper, Aliza, and 1 innocent Frenchman. The government blamed the far right. We saw the fingerprints of the PFLP. Copernic launched 2 years of 73 shootings and bombings of Jewish and Israeli targets across Western Europe, 29 of them in France. It ended in August 1982 with the Goldenberg restaurant massacre. Why did it end? An Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon made European terrorists in Palestinian training camps flee. Once home, they forgot the Jews, they needed money, and began attacking banks and embassies. So France, Italy, Germany cracked down, showing the truth of the late Simon Wiesenthal's note saying that what starts with the Jews never ends with them. This ended the first wave of anti-Semitic terror. Fast forward 30 years. I was in Ottawa, invited by Owen Kotler, I don't know if he's sitting in the room, In Ottawa, Hassan Diab, a suspect for the Copernic bombing, faced an extradition procedure trial in France. After 2 years, he used a window of opportunity to escape back to Canada, while an appeal against him was still pending. A few days later, he was back in Ottawa with his family, a hero for the Palestinian cause. Now, do we have the slides? Slides? No? Hello? The slides. Thank you. Okay, I'll move on because of time. Next week, are they getting the slides? Okay. Next week, we mark the Buenos Aires bombing of the Israeli embassy in 1992 and the Amir Jewish Center in 1994. In London, with the Henry Jackson Society, still no, yeah, there is the slide on Copernic. The next one, please. The next one. Yep. Okay. No next one? Oh, that's it. Okay, yeah. No, go back. So, the Amir Jewish Center in 1994, with the loss of 85 lives, with the Henry Jackson Society and the Argentine ambassador to England, we brought an Argentine lawyer, a survivor, a British QC of the Pinochet extradition, to ensure that the Interpol read notices implicating the 6, now 5, Iranians. If any one of them touched British soil, they would be detained and sent for trial to Argentina. Sadly, the current Peronista government is more part of the problem than the solution. So this was the first wave of terror imported from the Middle East. The second was a transplantation of the 2000 Intifada to Europe, enacted by young native-born and radicalized in mosques, playing out a game of cowboys and Indians, refitted as Palestinians and Israelis. Their local target were Jewish neighbors living side by side in the communist-red slum rings around major cities. And then the third wave, of course, included lone wolf jihadis. A few words on Durban and where Durban is going, although it's been discussed. There are several Durban survivors here, I don't know if in the room. As the only Jew elected to the NGO International Steering Committee, I participated in PrepComs in Geneva, Santiago, Warsaw, excluded from the final in Tehran. In a session on Holocaust denial, the PLO candidates slinked behind me and whispered in my ear, "We will give you the Holocaust if you give us Palestine." Is Ido still here? No? Okay. A Dutch activist snapped a photo of my horrified face. On arrival in Durban, I was expelled to shout to the world Jew. What's important is that on December, 3 months later, I attended uninvited the final International Steering Committee in Geneva. And here, please, the next one. No, next one. Yeah, there. Can you read it? Okay. Here was an 8-point plan circulated for the next debate. It was to become the roadmap to demonize and delegitimize Israel and its supporters for the following decades. So as you can run through it, an educational inculcation campaign through UN agencies on apartheid Israel, a legal campaign in the ICC, which is now, of course, taking its course, cancellation of the law of return for Jews to Israel, its replacement by the right of return for all Palestinians, reactivation of the dormant economic boycott, cultural, scientific, sports, academic embargoes now known as BDS, rupture of diplomatic relations, rendering Israel a pariah state, penalties for states and NGOs refusing to comply. Now, the vector for this and for Durban was now based in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in the Anti-Globalization World Social Forum. At its first edition, I stood in a stadium with 76,000 young militants screaming "Viva la Intifada Global." But it was there that BDS was planned. Each year we would learn the forthcoming campaigns, for example, an early warning meeting of the Gaza flotillas and flytillas. I suggest to Charles that despite the wonderful turnout of 9 countries so far, we will boycott Durban 4. I suggest that we go beyond that, and people from different countries here should put pressure, particularly on the big ones, Germany, France, etc. The book of Amos spoke of the 3 sins of Damascus, or 3 sins of Durban, and the 4th, which would receive no reprieve. I'll go back very quickly now on Charlie Hebdo. In January 2015, the murderous assaults on Charlie Hebdo. Please go to the next one. Yeah. And the kosher supermarket resulted in 17 dead. Here hung a question. If there had been only the Jewish target, would millions have marched and over 50 world leaders arrived in Paris? Or would it have remained one more footnote in the litany of anti-Semitic attacks? You can see there our balloon with police, Charlie, Jews, etc. In the 2014 demonstrations, pro-Palestinians, I would walk backwards in Paris in the opposite direction. Thus, if I would be identified, I would be on the way. I saw a neighboring concierge, I saw a teller from our bank, and we said they have every right to demonstrate, but until the pro-Hamas marchers panel off to attack Jewish institutions. I don't know if any of you saw my article the day before yesterday in the Jerusalem Post on the Egyptian book fair. We monitor each year 7-hour book fairs and the Fair of Fairs in Frankfurt. Each year we give a Most Offensive Stand award, last year to Iran for children's books extolling Shahada. Please. But the most important of these books that we found, and go please to the next book, the next, next one. Okay, that's Egypt, and the last one. Okay, this is the Burak War. Do any of you know who was Burak? Burak was the horse which brought Muhammad flying from Mecca to heaven via Jerusalem, where he tethered his horse to a wall. The book identifies the Kotel, the Western Wall, that the Jews stole and must be returned to Islam. And of course, this is political. The wall has the Mughrabi ramp, which is in bad state, to the Temple Mount. If the Kotel were Muslim, it would be a major entry into the sacred basin, and it would cover the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, render non-Muslims as trespassers. Israel, out of religious respect, never removed the plaque, Burak, leading down to it. And I would like to just give you one more example, and that is an anti-Semitism that has emanated from UNESCO, which I call ID theft. The German strategist von Clausewitz said that diplomacy is war by other means. And since the entry in 2011 of Palestine, UNESCO has become a battlefield for the ID theft of Christian and Jewish historical sites regarding the Temple Mount. Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Please go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah, the next one. Yeah. Okay, here is me having my 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Finally, to close, perhaps with an early antidote or vaccine of sorts, our exhibition, People Book Land, Jewish Trinity, and I want to just say this in memory and honor of the patron of the exhibition, the late Robert Wistrich, Zichrono Livracha, who entitled this The 3,500-Year Relationship with the Jewish People in the Holy Land. And the 24 panels run from Abraham the father, please the next, yeah. This is a sort of a payback against the Palestinian story, which is replete with the Jewish narrative. For example, there's a book which came out afterwards, The 4,000 Years of Palestine. And this was in order to be against us. What it really did was it took out, for example, Palestine Airways, which was the Yishuv, etc. So here we have this exhibition. And before, final one. Next one, please. Next one, please. Anybody? Yeah, right. That's in the British Parliament. And a parliamentary official, before granting approval, asked what relevance this had for the British Parliament. I argued the thread of human rights, Moses demanding to free the slaves, a day of rest, a seventh year for fallow fields, first recognition of climate change, women's rights, as forebears to Magna Carta. The official responded, accepted. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Shimon. So the next speaker, I hope, will be Professor Vadino. Is he online?
I am. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. I hear you well. Go ahead. The floor.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me today. And my apologies for not being able to be there in person. I hope it will happen soon. But really appreciate the invitation to such an important event. Shimon is always a tough act to follow, and he brings a lot of personal experience to the topic. And I think he defines some of the issues that we have seen in the West when it comes to anti-Semitism, the multiplicity of sources of anti-Semitism within Muslim communities in Europe and North America. The topic today is Islamism, is radical Islam, and I think what's important to address is arguably the biggest movement that within Islamism in the West has been spreading anti-Semitism, which is unquestionably the Muslim Brotherhood and groups that are somewhat fellow travelers of the Brotherhood. So that would be Jamaat Islami for the South Asian diaspora, and Milli Görüş for the Turkish diaspora in Europe. But what Europeans have started to call participationist Islamist or legalistic Islamist. So those movements within the large macro category of Islamism that participate in the democratic process, that do not necessarily break the law in most of what they do. Of course, their actions do not necessarily respond to their true beliefs. Their belief in democracy is arguably purely tactic, it's not heartfelt. Their idea to participate in society, to mingle and be seen as representatives and gatekeepers of the Muslim community with European establishments is purely tactical and something that they do not out of heartfelt belief in integration and life in Europe. But it has led these groups to be disproportionately influential. And I think this is, when it comes to anti-Semitism, a very important matter to understand. Because of course, these groups have been, those that have been disseminating anti-Semitism on a scale that is not comparable to any other group. The ability of, I'll call them legalistic Islamists, but we can basically say Muslim Brotherhood inspired organizations to have a certain platform, and both within the Muslim community and with European establishments is what allows them to reach a much broader audience, and therefore to disseminate anti-Semitism on a scale that no other movement has been able to. Now, I think we understand a lot of these dynamics. What I would like to do in the relatively short time that I have is to talk about how some European governments have been addressing the phenomenon over the last couple of years. And here I'll probably do something relatively unusual, which is bringing a glimmer of hope and being somewhat of a partial optimist. when it comes to how, again, some European governments have been dealing with Islamist groups and how this has an impact on anti-Semitism. If these groups are the main purveyors of anti-Semitism, the fact that some European governments have been cracking down on them or at least have taken a different viewpoint on them compared to the past is something quite important. The speeches that French President Emmanuel Macron has given over the last couple of years about separatism, communitarism, and in general, political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood is something that has surprised quite a few people, but has been widely misunderstood in most of the Anglo-Saxon world. But it's something that captures a mood that I would say exists throughout continental Europe, that sees the French and the Austrian government as being particularly aggressive about, but it is also seen in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Italy, in Belgium, in Denmark, and even in Sweden, which has notoriously been not exactly strong when it comes to tackling political Islam. What we are seeing is a growing understanding of the fact that what some call non-violent Islamists, although that's a widely debatable label, but that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamists that are not ISIS or Al-Qaeda, are very much part of the problem, are hardly part of the solution, and should be confronted, should be challenged in a variety of ways. Now, the fact that they are legal in what they do, in that they operate for the most part within the law, is something that creates a problem in how you tackle them. The solutions are obviously very different to how you tackle ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But that growing understanding of the problem of the Brotherhood and political Islam is something that has become very mainstream in Europe. It's something that maybe 10 years ago was mostly a right, center-right issue. Now it's become an issue that many at the center, the left, and very much even in some cases in the extreme left do understand. The conversation has changed quite a bit. Now, what are the concerns on the part of the French government, the Austrian government, and a few others in continental Europe? I think the UK is a bit of a different story, unfortunately. The understanding is twofold, is that first of all, these groups provide the mood music. I'm quoting something that the Quilliam Foundation used to say a few years ago, so Haras can build on that. Provide a conducive environment for more radical groups to recruit on. They provide a narrative of division, of hatred, of polarization that makes it easy for recruiters for groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on to tap into and to further radicalize people who are in the audience of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. But second, the second point that is leading a lot of Europeans to change their attitude when it comes to Islamism is the understanding that even if not directly linked to violence, or even indirectly, the narrative that they push, and they do so on platforms which are much bigger than any other group, are extremely polarizing, are very poisonous from a social cohesion integration point of view. And the sticking points that Europeans will quote consistently when expressing their concerns about Islamists are women's rights, gay rights, and anti-Semitism. And if you see, for example, some of the bills that have been introduced in the Austrian parliament, in the French parliament, in Denmark, you will see that those core points are the ones that are being used in legislation that tries to diminish the influence, tries to tackle non-violent Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Obviously, what to do is much more, it's fairly complicated. It's the first part where I relatively optimistic is the fact that we are getting to a better assessment, a better understanding of the negative impact that these groups have. The second part is what to do about it. And I think we're starting to see action on three different fronts. The first one is something Charles alluded to, is funding. Groups like different spin-offs of the Brotherhood throughout Europe and in North America have been receiving hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 40, 50 years. To this day, it's mostly from Qatar and Turkey. Some of the funds that goes to these organizations even comes from European governments themselves, which at times in a very naive way fund activities when it comes to integration, discrimination, aid work, wittingly or unwittingly funding Islamist organizations. Many of these issues are now being understood and are being changed. Several European countries have been passing laws that make it difficult for Islamist groups to collect money both abroad and domestically. The second thing that is happening is we're seeing more prosecutions of individuals linked to Brotherhood networks. Quite a few individuals have been charged or been investigated for specifically anti-Semitic views, particularly in the countries that have the harshest anti-Semitism laws. In Austria, in November of last year, Austrian authorities carried out a large operation which targeted some 30 individuals that the Austrians charged to be leaders of the Brotherhood network in the country. So with all the difficulties of tackling an entity which is not a terrorist entity per se, we're seeing movement when it comes to more attention from prosecutors and authorities. And finally, there's the more political side of it, which is if perhaps these groups cannot really be tackled by law, they cannot be arrested. And I think they do have a right in many cases to operate within the democratic framework, whether we like it or not, they have that constitutional right. What is happening is that more policymakers are understanding and giving them a platform is not the right approach, that they are part of the problem and not part of the solution, that engaging them and treating them as the moderate representative of Muslim communities is something that is extremely problematic. So I'm probably painting a slightly rosier picture than what it actually is. I think I'm seeing a pattern that I'm hoping goes in a certain direction. But I do see that from an anti-Semitism point of view, this approach that several continental European countries have taken is something that can be extremely conducive at limiting the influence of arguably the group that has, of course, it's not been the only one, but arguably the group that more than any other, because of its resources, because of its reach, has been able to disseminate anti-Semitic views. If it diminishes its influence, I think that is a very positive step. Hardly the solution to the entire problem, but definitely a positive step. I do have to say, unfortunately, I think we're seeing somewhat of a gap when it comes to the understanding of the challenge posed by Islamism between continental Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. If the level of the conversation and understanding that Islamism, with all the problems that it creates, anti-Semitism being one of them, is a major issue that's fairly mainstream, as I said, in Europe, the conversation has gone somewhat backwards in the UK, and that kind of conversation is, I would say, almost absent in the United States. And I think that's quite a frustrating dynamic. And I think also in the US, we've gone a bit backwards when it comes to understanding the challenge posed by Islamism. I do see, and since this is one of the questions that we were asked to address, some positive potential. Again, I'm unusually optimistic today in the impact that the Abrahamic Accords might have on a further understanding of the problem when it comes to the Europeans. I think to many Europeans, the Abrahamic Accord were something that made them understand that Brotherhood organizations are not really representatives of Muslim communities and of Islam. That listening to Brotherhood representatives as self-appointed spokespeople for the Muslim community in, for example, understanding what the Middle East thinks about Israel, what the Arab world thinks about Israel, it's misguided, because obviously the Accords demonstrated that the wind is blowing in a very different directions in at least part of the Middle East, and that sort of mindset very common in European chancellery, I would say 10, 15 years ago, in which, oh, if only we could solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and make Israel make concessions, then Middle East will be fine and there will be less anti-Semitism. I think that many geopolitical events have diluted that very misguided understanding of the dynamic, but I think the accords have been a major one. And I think, again, the fact that some of the countries that have signed the accords on the Arab side have a very strong position when it comes to Islamism. That's not just the UAE, but that's the same goes for Bahrain, the same goes for Morocco. It's further proof for the Europeans that working with Islamists, being soft on Islamists, seeing Islamists as the future of the Arab world is somewhat of a misguided policy on many levels, that both their claims of representatives and moderation are really not true. So I need to close with the obvious caveat that I've been almost provocative in my optimism, that the problems are immense, that we're seeing somewhat of a trend in some European countries, but it's easily reversible. And there are still many forces that operate in the opposite direction. But I thought it was maybe a good thing to do to have this bring a little glimmer of hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorenzo. So Lorenzo, please stand by for the Q&A, and thank you very much for your contribution. Next, Haris Rafiq has the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Charles, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm a late entry, stand-in for some of the people that aren't able to make it. I am doing another session, so what I'll do today is just, at this session, talk about a few things that can build onto the hope, the solutions in the next session, which is what I was asked to do. So I'm going to talk about resilience within Muslim communities, not community. I'm going to talk about pathways, how people are being radicalized, how are they acting, at a macro level, maybe 8, how the lens is created and how people are taken through the lens and what is the output. I'm going to talk about some definitions. I think it's important to define what it is that we're talking about, then give you some bad news, and then move on to the good news later on. So please do join the other session. I want to start by something, and I say this as somebody who got into this area of work by accident in 2002/3. Since then, has been an advisor for a number of prime ministers, secretaries of state. I've worked for Europol as an advisor, and I've had the honor and privilege to work with former commanders for Osama bin Laden against the Soviets, who I counted as colleagues at the Quilliam Foundation, completely rehabilitated, people who've spent time in Mubarak's torture chambers for being Islamists, now completely rehabilitated, and a number of other former jihadis. And we played a role in that de-radicalization and rehabilitation. The first thing I want to say is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda does not radicalize anybody. They don't do it. People will have heard on so many news channels, so many outputs, ISIS radicalized such and such a person radicalized by Al-Qaeda, such and such a person radicalized by Boko Haram, etc., etc. They don't radicalize anybody. What they do is they take people that have been radicalized by Islamists to a certain point and then tip them over the edge to justify violence. And I'm going to talk about those stages in a minute. But also, I want to talk about some definitions. What is Islamism? What is it? How is it different to me as a Muslim who's not an Islamist? What is jihadism as opposed to jihad that's mentioned in the Quran? Because it's important to understand some of these things. The first point is that Islamism is not a made-up word. You'll hear some people on the progressive left say that Islamism is a made-up word and you shouldn't use it, etc., etc. Well, Islamism is not a made-up word. It's what the Muslim Brotherhood intellectuals use themselves in Egypt to differentiate themselves from ordinary Muslims. So how is it different to Islam? Well, Just as we have a difference between social and socialism, social is the way that we interact. Socialism happens to be a distinct political ideology that happens to be left of center. Islam is a religion that is practiced by just under 2 billion people around the world in so many different ways. And quite often, most of them will curse the other, calling them infidels, blah, blah, kafir, etc., etc. That's okay. Islamism is a distinct political ideology that happens, it's contemporary, that happens to want three things. Very important to note. The first thing is to set up a utopian state and enforce a version of fiqh. There's no such thing as Sharia law. There's fiqh jurisprudence. And I could go on and give a whole lecture on why the word Sharia law doesn't apply. In the Quran, the Arabic word for law is qanun. It doesn't exist in the Quran, nor does it exist in the Hadith, Sahih and Bukhari. It's a man-made construct. So, yeah, but they want to enforce a version of fiqh jurisprudence, a state law on everybody in a state. We saw that with ISIS, they tried to do it, and we also saw it with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. When they got elected through a democratic process, they tried to change the constitution of Egypt to bring in this element. The second thing they want is to spread that around the world so that every single bit of the earth has what they call the flag of Sharia or fiqh. And so that's imposed on everybody. And the third thing, wipe Israel off the map. Three things they want. Totally different to what Muslims generally want. The other thing is, what is jihadism? Well, jihadism is the support of violence in the cause of Islamism, which is different to a jihad, a spiritual jihad, jihad al-akbar, which could be just meditating, doing good, being a better human being. So these are some definitions I think that are very important. The other definition, and I kind of want to say this now, I've heard a number of people this morning use the term Islamophobia. You guys have heard it? Maybe even used it, some of you. Stop using it. Absolutely stop using it. And I'll tell you why in a minute. It is a term that's used by the Islamists, whether they're in Iran or whether they're in Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islami, or other people, to quite often stop legitimate critique of their perspective on Islam. So what should you use and why shouldn't you use it? Well, I live in the UK. The UK is a liberal secular democracy. So is Israel. So are many other countries. In a liberal, Islam is a set of ideas and a set of values that I choose to accept a certain interpretation as a Muslim. Being Muslim isn't a race. I choose to accept a certain interpretation, ideas and values. In a liberal secular democracy, no set of ideas or values, whatever they are, whether they're even my own faith, should be beyond legitimate critique. However, no individual should be beneath dignity. So what's more appropriate is a terminology that we use, which is anti-Muslim hatred or anti-Muslim bigotry, because that does exist as well. By using Islamophobia, all you're doing is legitimizing and supporting a lot of the Islamist organizations. So please stop using it. So let's talk about resilience. Why is it important? Well, the other thing I will say is that we've also heard a lot about the far left today and the far right and Islamist theocracy. It's the triple threat. This is what we've been saying for years. The triple threat when it comes to anti-Semitism are these three things. And more specifically, when it comes to anti-Semitism, the left just closes the left eye, the right wants to burst a blood vessel, and the Islamists claim that they have divine inspiration from above. The three feed off each other and have a symbiotic relationship, which is being spread, which has been spread at a rate that's been so phenomenal over social media, over the way that we communicate. China has just apparently demonstrated the first quantum computer. I don't know what's coming next. If we think the way that people are being radicalized or the way that people are becoming anti-Semitic in the world is changing now, whatever technology comes next, I don't know, unless we do something about it. I also posed the question at this conference in 2009, and I posed the question, I said, is anti-Semitism becoming the default position for Muslims under the age of 40 in the West? There was a question, I didn't have any data. It was a question, it was something I could feel, and there's more a sort of a let's all rally around and do something about it. Well, anti-Semitism right now, and my next session will show how and why, anti-Semitism has become the default position for Muslims under the age of 40 in the West. Islamism has had, it's not just Islamism, but Islamism has had a huge role to play in that. There's also been legitimization by the far left and a whole, but I could go on to that. But Islamism is the topic of the conversation today. Let's talk about resilience. Why is it important that we all do play our role? Why, me as a Muslim, other people who are Jewish, people who are Christian, people of faith, people of no faith. Why is it important? Well, I'm going to share with you something that my ex-line manager, Gilda Kakov, who is the head of the EU counterterrorism unit at Europol, said in an open forum sitting next to me in Prague, so I can tell you about it now. He said, we defined 3 areas of interest when it comes to people who are active and ready to become operational when it comes to attacks, whether they're anti-Semitic attacks, whether they're jihadist attacks, whatever they are. And we defined them into 3 categories. The first one, people who directly support the violence. And there's X%, and it varies around the world. The next one is people who sympathize with the ideas. And these are the Islamists of the organizations that support this violence. And then you have that's Y%. Then you have Z%, which is people who don't believe in any of this, aren't really anti-Semitic, they claim. They're not really anti-Semitic, but empathize with the whole means, the objectives ultimately. Gilda Kakov said, and that's why I can tell you, because otherwise I couldn't tell you, bound by confidentiality. At Europol, he said the shortest time he has seen somebody being classified as being empathetic, moving to sympathetic, moving to support and becoming operational before they were arrested is 2 weeks. That's what we're dealing with. And this particular person that he's talking about, he didn't name him, I know it is, so therefore I can't name him, was on his way to actually go and find somebody who was Jewish and kill him. 3.5 months before he was arrested, he was Christian. He wasn't even Muslim. This is the rate at which people are being radicalized, and that's why we've been screaming for years now, building the resilience amongst Muslim communities so they don't get radicalized to anti-Semitism and other forms of extremism is so important. And we all have a role to play in that. The next one is really about the pathways. 1 minute? Okay. Pathways, if you want to know about the pathways, come to the next session. I will put a wonderful slide up there and we'll see that. What I want to end on is there is hope. It's now no longer, I used to say that anti-Semitism is in the DNA of Islamism, but it's not in the DNA of Islam. I've done lectures for ISCAP on that. I can't do that anymore after the last conflict. Sadly, my own communities, the communities I come from, the Barelwi Sufi communities, many of the others who were responsible for the convoys that we all heard about, who were responsible for calling out jihad, combative jihad, have been radicalized to anti-Semitism. It is no longer sufficient to say that we need a vaccine against anti-Semitism within Muslim communities, whether they're Islamist or not. It's too late. What we need now is the chemotherapy. And that's where I believe that we all still have a role to play, and I will talk about that a little bit more in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harris, Schumann, and Lorenzo. So now we have time for some questions, and I'll turn the floor over to people in the audience so we can have more of an interaction. Please.
Thank you. That's a question for the last speaker. I had a remark and a question. So first remark, you were talking about Islamophobia, and you said don't stop use the words guys. So the guys don't use the word. Actually, that's what I wanted to say. I was talking about that today. That's the word that was invented, and you're absolutely right, by Islamists. And it is used normally in France, only in Europe, by the radical left. And this is a word that actually we try to criticize because, well, as I explained, it defends any critiques of Islam. So that's absolutely right. I don't know if we are using the word. That's probably our enemies that are using the word. That was the remark. And the question was if there is any word in Arabic that translates what we use in European languages as Islamism.
Yes, first of all, I wasn't, when we were talking, listening to you speak this morning, myself and the colleagues I was sitting on a table actually really liked your speech, and absolutely you weren't promoting it. But there were others, there were some, I won't say who, there were others. Yes, the Arabic word Islamiyun, that's what they use. Islamiyun is the word that the Muslim Brotherhood academics used in the 1930s and 40s, etc., to differentiate themselves from ordinary Muslims. And a direct translation of that is Islamists and Islamism.
Any questions on the Zoom?
Is there anybody on Zoom that would like to ask a question?
Okay. Anybody else has a question?
I have a question. Anybody else? I want to. Okay. So for Lorenzo, you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
And also Shimon and Harris could address this as well. I think you spoke something that I've noticed that I think is very important. Whoop. Lorenzo, you're there?
I'm here.
Okay, the screen's gone.
It's the light. It's on me. Sorry, my fault.
All right, so Lorenzo, you point out that you were saying in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the UK and in the United States, there doesn't seem to be the intensity of dealing with anti-Semitism and political Islam that you find, I think, in France and other parts of the world, part of the policy debate for a longer time. You're sitting in Washington, and as this explosion of anti-Semitism has occurred in the United States, we have the so-called squad with connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, I may say, and the Democratic Party not, in my view, dealing adequately with the discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood infiltrating the Democratic Party. And as our colleagues were saying earlier today, the Jewish community is approximately 80-odd% supportive of the Democratic Party. They identify as liberal or progressive. So can you speak to the dynamics of the changing discourse in the United States, which is influenced to some extent by the Brotherhood and anti-Semitism, and where you sit, what do you think is the situation, and how can the Jewish community deal with this emerging, I don't know if it's a crisis, but certainly a serious problem?
Yes. Well, I think to some degree it's a perfect storm, because on one hand, the discourse in the US has completely moved away from anything that has to do with Islamism. It really doesn't have to do with Islamism itself. It has to do with American politics and what has happened to American politics over the last 10 years. And it's very complicated, of course, but in a nutshell, the Obama administration wanted to move away from Islamism, didn't want to really touch it. And then Trump kind of wanted to, although never really did much about it. But of course, anything that Trump was against became something that was liked by the general debate that didn't like Trump. So on one hand, really Islamism became a known issue. You can argue that pains me on a personal level that most of the people who really talk about Islamism in the States are fairly marginalized. It's a completely different debate. I divide my time between the US and Europe, at least in a pre-pandemic world. And while in Europe this conversation is extremely mainstream, in the States, I find where you can count on one hand the people who would be interested in even having a conversation when it comes to policymakers or or journalists. Of course, there's an interest in ISIS, and whenever there was an attack, yes, that's of interest. But it felt like the analysis was that attacks came out of nowhere, that people radicalize out of thin air, and I think we're all in agreement, at least on this panel, but that's not exactly what the situation. The other side of the equation, which is why I called it a perfect storm, is that Islamist groups in the US are paradoxically much more, or at least more sophisticated than their counterparts in Europe. That has to do with the background of who belongs to the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is an elite organization, and it came to the West mostly as graduate students coming from the Middle East, going to university in the West. And where are the best universities where people could go? The American university system welcomed them more than most European ones. So the Brotherhood always had a very large presence in the States, but it's significantly well developed, well entrenched. And over the last few years, it has learned very well on how to use a certain language, how not to talk about certain things, and how to use the language of post-colonial theory and the woke jargon, and to strike all the right alliances. We do see that several activists that come from the Brotherhood milieu work with the Democratic Party. You mentioned the Squad, but I see it even more visible at the sort of lower local level, with activists with very prominent last names, children of the founders of the Brotherhood in America, running for elections or being spokespeople for prominent Democratic politicians. So when you put all this together, you lead to a situation in which there's no debate. The few that try to have a debate about Islamism and anti-Semitism being one of the natural byproducts of Islamism are marginalized. Sometimes they don't do it right in terms of their framing of the criticism of Islamism, but they're very marginalized. It's a complete opposite of what happens in Europe. It's very different from the way it was 15 years ago, where you had a relatively mainstream debate about Islamism and anti-Semitism being a byproduct of it, where you had the Washington Post running stories about mosques in America spreading problematic views and anti-Semitic views. That's impossible. Today, only memory does it, and does it very well, but it never reaches the mainstream.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Shimon, do you have any comments on this issue? You're sitting in France. When you look across the pond, what are your thoughts?
I return your compliment, Lorenzo. Lorenzo was he was a witness in a 4.5-year trial that I had by the French branch of Hamas for 5 words, and in France it's criminal defamation. So finally we won. I would like to say that the situation in France has become very mixed. For example, the judges, the way the judgments are made. The judges were taught by students in the 1968 revolution. Today, they look at the Islamists and their actions as they are the victims of racism. And they cannot believe the victims of racism can also be perpetrators of racism. So they slap them on the wrist. There's a rotating door. And as we see, for example, also in the case of Sarah Halimi, the fact that the murderer was covered because he was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And the justice system in France is infiltrated by this. And I see it as a major problem. Also, I think that more emphasis should be looked at in the marriage between left and Islamism. It's not new. Back in Entebbe, we all remember that it was Germans together with Arabs on the plain. And finally, there are elements, there's a growing Shia community in France. It's very small, but it is growing. And in fact, there's a bridge to it from the Sunni majority. That is the very proud anti-Semite Dieudonné. But I think that none of these questions have really been developed.
I think, Shimon, what you're talking about there is what we call the bigotry of low expectations when it comes to Islamists. It's almost like the natives don't know any better, they can't be racist because they are suffering from racism themselves. So it's this bigotry of low expectation. The values that wouldn't apply to other people, they're applying to Islamists. And then slap on the wrist, they don't know any better. But certainly in the UK, there's been, as Lorenzo knows, Lorenzo was involved in the Muslim Brotherhood review that the Conservative Party started a few years ago, which never really got released in its full format. In the UK, there's been a lot of political inconsistency. I remember after 7/7, Tony Blair actually, and I worked with him, he named the problem. He said the problem is Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and he said also Wahhabist theology. He named the problem. And he managed to get his minister, Ruth Kelly, Hazel Blair's, to remove the Islamists from the government table, because they were the only people who were talking to the government at the time. Then Gordon Brown came along and he decided he wanted to build a big tent. So let's bring them back in. Because their supporters, you know, I've known them for a while. Then we had the coalition in the election with the Lib Dems and the Conservative Party, and the Islamists started gaining a lot more traction. A number of ministers that the coalition put into place were fellow travelers of Islamists. I can't call them Islamists themselves. And then Cameron started to do some good work after the election. He'd lost the Brexit vote, resigned, and now it's a mess. It really is a mess. We have an all-party parliamentary group in the UK called British Islam or British Muslims. It's run by Islamist organizations. This is right in the heart of Parliament. All of the political parties, apart from the Conservative Party, thank God, the government, has accepted the Islamophobia definition that these Islamists have put forward. They formally accepted them. And what we've got now is that the Islamists are recruiting the moderates and also buying a lot of sympathy from the wider non-Muslim communities, because they're really focusing on Islamophobia, but also on blasphemy, Israel-Palestine, and the other one's the Ahmadiyya community. And this is where I see the hypocrisy of the Muslims who want to support the BDS movement and call on support for the BDS movement. And they say, why do they want it? Because, well, the Israelis are committing genocide against Palestinians and it's an apartheid state, blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But where the hypocrisy lies is, where is the call for the BDS movement against Pakistan, which was also, you know, similar to Israel, formed for a particular identity that happened to be Islam, and their treatments of the Ahmadiyyas. Where are the calls for the BDS movement against China, who we believe, according to all the reports, that there is a genocide going on now. Certainly a number of countries have recognized it formally as a genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. So it's really all around the Islamist propaganda. But at this moment in time, the Islamists have quite a hold within the media and the opposition parties in the UK.
Thank you. So there's a question here. Anybody else has a question?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I also want to let you know that we have a couple of questions from people connected virtually.
Okay, wonderful. So the first question here, then we'll go through.
Thank you. Moshe David Cohen, Rabbi of Malmö in Sweden. Slightly different perspective. Question regarding the danger of work on anti-Semitism actually pushing people off towards extremism within Islam. In other words, this sense of they are against us, and moderate or would-be partners of resilience within Muslim communities, actually maybe us not being careful enough in our definitions of Islam, even radical Islam, and then having even promoting that fear, thereby creating more separation and divide.
Certainly, look, you make some very valid points, but the problem is that where we are right now with a lot of these, I won't say which country, but it's certainly in Scandinavia. It's one of the countries, Denmark, Sweden, etc. One of those countries. There was a large Islamist organization that had been receiving a lot of funds from the government, and it was exposed in the media that they were anti-Semitic. Very clearly anti-Semitic. It's in they are ideologically anti-Semitic. The only way to stop them from being anti-Semitic is to change their ideology in this instance. And I got a call from a leading Jewish organization who wanted my advice because the government there said, perhaps you can give them some training on anti-Semitism and perhaps they won't be anti-Semitic anymore. It's not enough. All that training, and I gave them that advice, all they wanted was a tick in the box. What they really needed and need is ideological rehabilitation. And until that happens, it's in their ideology, they will be anti-Semitic. There are other things that can be done, working on sort of lots of other things, but I won't go into that. Please join my other lecture.
Thank you. So, our virtual colleagues, does anybody have a question? People on the internet?
I'm going to read them. That's
Okay.
all right. The first is from Judith Weissman for Mr. Aras Rafiq. What did you mean by chemotherapy? And what can you say about the fact that the ideology of Islam and anti-Semitism penetrates deeply into the higher educational institutions of the most prestigious universities in Europe and the United States?
Okay, first of all, I mean, Charles mentioned the good work that ISCAP's done in identifying over $3 billion of undocumented money that's come into the US from Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist affiliated organizations and states. There's much more than that. It's led to a federal investigation, and I think it's over 10 billion, maybe $18 billion. It's the same story whether you go into the UK or whether you go into Europe. As people who want to talk with facts and not just assumptions, what's needed right now is to find out how that has changed the anti-Semitic discourse, and I'm sure maybe that's something ISCAP will do. But look, with that amount of money, I feel that things have changed, whether it's within the students' unions, whether it's in the Muslim, the ISOCs, Islamic societies, and a whole bunch of other reasons. So yeah, it's a huge impact. And the other thing about the chemotherapy is that I don't believe that we're at a situation right now where we can rely on things like interfaith. I've done interfaith, and my apologies, I will talk about this later on. I think we need to move on to other things. In the case study that I'm going to present at the next presentation, I will present a case study of somebody who I vouched for in 2006, who got an OBE for the work that he did whilst working for me, who was heavily involved in interfaith, who at the recent conflict called at a march, called Israelis vile Jews, called for BDS and called for the destruction of the country, etc., etc., etc. We need to move that. That was always there inherent in him. We need to move on to intercultural, and we need to move on to better de-radicalization and rehabilitation programs.
I think in terms of the university, so we know that the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, Turkey, other organizations, foreign and domestic, are funding American and European universities. Yosef Kawadawi, for example, a man who said that the true believer, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, that the true believer is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. This is a man who helped to establish Islamic studies at Oxford University. Tariq Ramadan, the grandfather of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, is still on the staff.
The grandson.
The grandson, sorry. Of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's still on the staff on leave at Oxford University, despite being arrested for violent crimes against, sexual crimes against women. The power that he's still on the faculty is amazing. So the funds, the activities of the Brotherhood has affected universities. And I'll say one more thing that I came across recently. It was in 1976, Edward Said, who's a very important thinker, said that he was the inheritor of the work of Adorno and the Frankfurt School of Thought. That he was the last remaining Jewish intellectual, that all the Jewish intellectuals were in the suburbs of America getting fat, basically consuming. So he was the last remaining Jewish intellectual. Think about the inversion and the old Christian forms of anti-Semitism and replacement theory. He's the last Jewish intellectual, and that the Palestinians are the Jews, and that the Jews are the Nazis. As absurd as this was in 1976, if you go to Middle East studies centers and departments at the best universities in the United States of America, in Canada, in Europe, this is the education that you will receive. And it is now permeated into social science, into social theory. The Jews, the victims of the Holocaust, are the Nazis, and that the Palestinians, the Jews are the Nazis, and the Palestinians are the victim of the Nazis. As absurd as that was in 1976, this is the discourse. This is the discourse coming out of universities, coming out of the New York Times, coming out of the Congress of the United States of America. The Jews who were murdered, systematically exterminated for not being white, are now the epitome of whiteness and elitism. The Jews are being defined of who they are once again. And we're not being defined as white, sorry for the Holocaust, sorry for what happened, and welcome to the club. No, now we are the epitome of colonialism, of racism, and of apartheid. And this is the discourse coming out of universities that have been impacted by the funding of the Muslim Brotherhood, and just the reality is inverted. But when we have seeded the universities, and every year young people who learn to be citizens, who learn their ideas, who learn their values, who become future scholars, future journalists, future leaders of industry, where they learn these ideas and are socialized, and for 40 years come into society, it's no wonder that the anti-Semitism is now flourishing. And the Jewish organizations that fight for accuracy in the media, how can you fight accuracy in the media and demand retractions when the best schools of journalism are turning out another generation of people who perceive the Jews as the Nazis?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to a personal story. When I was CEO of Quilliam, we did a session, an event at Warwick University, and it was on Islam and homosexuality. And I was going to talk about the Tanzimat reforms, etc., that the Turks did, Ottomans did. And I was platformed by the Warwick University LGBT Society for being Islamophobic. And that was in 2016. And it's a big receiver of money that's coming in from Muslim Brotherhood entities.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anybody in the room would like to ask a question?
Yes, one more question from Anna. What is the main factor that allowed such penetration of hate to Muslim society? Why today it gets such high peak? And questions for both speakers. Do we have a real hope? Thank you.
Sorry, could you please repeat the question? I was speaking over you at the beginning. Sorry.
Yes. What is the main factor that allowed such penetration of hate to Muslim society? And do we have a real hope?
Lorenzo, can you hear?
Yes. I hope I understood the first question correctly. I might tackle that. I think if I understand correctly, is what has allowed the penetration of such hate into Muslim communities in the West. And I think it's a matter of leadership. It's a matter of resources and leadership. You mentioned Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Charles, and I think Qaradawi wrote a book exactly about that and about how the West constituted a great, unprecedented opportunity for the Brotherhood because it operated in a free environment where governments did not understand the challenge posed by Islamists, the threat they posed. So unlike in the Arab world, they could operate freely with all the rights given to them in a democratic setting, of course. And that led them, together with the massive resources they got from the Arab Gulf since the 1960s, to build an infrastructure of influence that spread a certain narrative within Muslim communities. And while I think it's always very difficult to assess empirically how prominent the Brotherhood is, I think most Muslims in the West would still somewhat be resistant to the Brotherhood, would still not be Islamist, but certain core messages, they're almost subliminally being absorbed by large parts of the Muslim community. When Haras says that anti-Semitism is the default position of young Muslims in Europe under 40, I think that's not an incorrect statement. And I think that is largely due to the narrative that has been pushed by the Brotherhood for the last 30, 40 years on a massive, massive scale. So it's a matter of the resources they had, the naive tolerance that the Europeans have had, and their skills, because you got to give it to them, in pushing for certain views. When you put these three aspects together, you see how a very skilled minority managed to have a disproportionate influence over a neutral community.
Yeah, it's the tail wagging the dog. It's three things also, just to add on to that. The first thing that they had to do was to convince Muslims that the faith that their parents brought, who were mainly Sufistic, Sufi traditions, fit into either bid'ah haram, kufr or shirk. That the practices that their parents brought are wrong, so change the Islam. That's the first thing. A whole bunch of ways they did it through, initially through magazines, TV channels, radios, now we have social media, internet, a whole bunch of ways. The second way is to, and by the way, they've taken the communist model, the way communism was spread. The second aspect is to set up these institutions, these organizations that Lorenzo's talked about, these inwardly representative and outwardly representative to the wider non-Muslim communities. And what did the UK especially say? Oh, well, you know what? We want one person or one organization that we can speak to on behalf of everybody else. And the Muslim Council of Britain was selected, and of course they're Islamist. But they created a whole range of them, and there are many of them. And the third thing is, as Lorenzo said, hundreds of billions of dollars pumped in to these organizations, these individuals, by countries in the Gulf, in the Middle East, who now, some of them who are actually opposed to Muslim Brotherhood for their own reasons and Islamism. But this is how they got in. What Lorenzo said, and just to put some more meat on the bone, the changing of the religion and the faith through tribalism and the mechanisms I've talked about.
Just as a footnote, we know more about the foreign entities that are importing money into Europe and North America, but how about domestic corporations? They're also being run by allies of these foundations in the Gulf. That's a whole other area that we haven't really scratched the surface, I would say.
And the hope. The person also asked about the hope. Shimon, do you want to?
Anyone do want a final word?
No, it's like, I didn't answer the question.
Would you like a final comment? Right. All right. So on that note, we've run out of time. Thank you for listening. Lorenzo Vadino from Washington. Thank you. Haris Rafiq, thank you for stepping in. And Shimon Samuels.
Thank you very much to all of our esteemed panelists. We will take a quick 15-minute break now. There's coffee and refreshments in the back, and we will reconvene at 3:45 p.m. for our next round of breakout sessions.